Hello and welcome back to Taking Point Leadership's YouTube live series. Today we are on a leadership journey part two, where we are interviewing and picking the brain of Mathew Lehnig, our VP of Programs, also a 30-year senior leader in naval special warfare. He and I had the opportunity and privilege to train together, go to war together, and he has stayed in giving most of his adult life to the special operations community. So first of all, Mathew, thank you so much. I'm Brent Gleeson, founder and CEO of Taking Point Leadership. You can learn more about our organization at takingpointleadership.com. And this series is brought to you by our new e-learning platform with our flagship program, a Change Leadership Certification course. And you can learn more about that program and sign up today at takingpointacademy.com. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Mathew, again, thanks for making the time today. Last time in part one, we really took a look back at some of your early days in your youth, and some of your mentors and people who you were inspired really at the beginning of your leadership journey. And then we took that up to the point where you had made the decision to go into the Navy, and specifically into naval special warfare. So today I wanted to spend some time continue to look back a little bit, and we'll kind of bring this conversation up through your early to latter part of your career in NSW as a leader. But let's go back about 20, 25 years. So get in our time machine. I know, it's crazy to even say that out loud. But let's get raw here for a minute. I want to look at back at, leadership as a lifelong journey. I could look back on my early days as a, entrepreneur and building companies and all the things I wish I had done differently. So looking back at your early days as an enlisted leader in naval special warfare in the SEAL teams, and what did that look like? And what would you, knowing now with your wisdom and your experience, what would you have done differently? What's one or two things you would definitely have done differently as a leader with all the knowledge you have now?
Well, that's a great question. I think I could have been a better role model outside of the expected persona, which was the SEAL teams. And what I mean by that is I was mentored by pipe hitters. Yeah. They lived and breathed the SEAL teams, right? Nothing really outside of that really mattered. Yeah. So I lived the ideology, and then I passed that on to the next generation. Now, the ideology itself, wasn't flawed. As it pertains to warfighters, it was outside of that where the problem lied. And what do I mean by that? I mean, outside of being a pipe hitter, which I was quite flawed in my mentorship capabilities. Okay. I wasn't a good role model outside of the SEAL teams. I definitely wasn't a good husband. I drank way too much. And, my mentality was, if you're weak, I would expose you and persecute you. My job, fundamentally was just to make you hard. And that's that. So I think being a little bit more forgiving would have been a better approach in my early years. As I grew out of my early years, of course, that became a bit more seasoned, a little bit better. I became a little bit better at that. So I think that was really kind of it. I wasn't really the best mentor. So when the workday was done, that's where things got a little dicey. I can be honest with you.
But that was the culture back then. It's an interesting point. Absolutely. Because when you become, part of and grow up in your youth and into your adulthood in an organization that has such a specific culture that's been forged intentionally or unintentionally or a hybrid thereof over decades of war and combat and brutal training, you get that old culture of the work hard, play hard, warrior mentality. But you've also had the benefit of seeing the organization evolve immensely into this modern era and become a more modern organization with
absolutely
different talent acquisition strategies, different leadership approach, different cultural elements that I think NSW has done a pretty good job of actively transforming to create a more well-rounded, sort of, for lack of a better phrase, mature warrior when we think of both on and off the battlefield capabilities, attributes, integrity, and all those different things. It's and there's certain behaviors I think you would agree that we try not to tolerate anymore. Because I remember when I came in as a new guy, you were my instructor, and I know instructor role is a little bit different than leading people in combat, but then we had the opportunity to go down range together where you were leading us in combat. So seeing those two dichotomies But then there was an evolution there. Obviously, as you grow in rank, you grow in tenure, you grow in responsibility, and as the organization has evolved under the necessity of the unfortunate reality of 20 years of conflict. I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good statement because when I first came in, all of the SEAL teams were not able to work with one another. It was quite interesting, right? Everybody had a different area that they worked in. All of the TTPs were different, SOPs were different. The language was different. And so that became very problematic. And then as we went into Force 21, a lot of that changed. And I think it changed right at the right time because at that point, we became more cohesive as an organization. So by the time the war kicked off, almost all organizations, East, West Coast, and then of course, Damnick, we could all work together. So I think as you look at the evolution, just within the warfighter, of course, the mentality had to evolve as well. So going from that drink, fight mentality, if you will,
drink again.
Right. We had to realize, that was no longer the focus. The focus was an ideology that needed to be wiped. And so, we went in with that mentality. So the drinking started to fade back and it was more, okay, now we're getting serious. So let's train the next generation of warfighters to be a little bit different in the way that they approach things. And so I think the great part about that is being able to transition from there. There was a lot of people that couldn't transition and got out. I was able to transition through that and, quite effectively and, continue to lead, both on and off the battlefield. So I think that was a very pivotal moment in my career, to be honest with you.
It's an interesting point because Naval Special Warfare never ceased to be one of the most elite and effective special operations organizations in the world. But you're talking about an immense amount of organizational change and transformation and culturally speaking.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you said, that sort of organically weeded a lot of people out, maybe some of the old guard who were like, I can't get on board with this. You see this in all the organizations we work with here at Taking Point Leadership. But it brings me to my next question about your journey and going back to where you started to see, because you were effective in not just evolving along with the organization, but you were playing a very specific role in leading change within the organization. So before we dive into some of that, I wanted to kind of see if there was a moment or a story or a period of time in your career where you started to realize that leadership maturity evolving and where you're realizing to yourself, you're like, or maybe you're getting feedback from others and things like that, or a combination thereof, where you're starting to see your real effectiveness, as a leader, as you grew in rank, as you grew in responsibility. Is there a story or a moment or a period of time that you can look back on and say, that's kind of where you saw yourself really becoming, a good leader of an evolving modern organization?
Yeah, I kind of hit that from a couple of fronts, which I think is important, a little bit of the backstory. So I was very meticulous in the way that I approach things, right? I have been diagnosed with OCD. At the time there wasn't anything like that, so I think it's kind of funny, and what was even more interesting is everybody knew I had OCD but me, so I even think that's even well, anyway, so I would break down every scenario quickly and efficiently, right? So I was very good at multitasking. So early on in my career, I would watch, I would listen, and I would absorb everything. So I was very good at implementing, my skill sets right after I learned them. I think the more seasoned operators, they caught on to that. They pulled me under their wings and, they pushed me really, really hard.
Yep.
And because of that, I think I honed my leadership skills and was able to explain things in a way that others could pick up quickly. I led, I coached, I mentored almost every new guy after my second platoon. My first two, I was being mentored and I was honing in my own personal skills. And I think where it became very prevalent was when I was an SQT instructor. Yeah. I think that's where I really put everything together. I focused on training the next generation of warfighters. And then, as you well know, almost all of them, including myself, we went down range and we all saw combat. And I think in that moment, I was like, okay, my skills are honed in pretty well. And then I think, to be honest, when I was actually downrange is where my leadership skills really shined. I
Thank
had no
God.
fear. Right. Well, I had no, I
Good,
mean, you were
good
there. I had
timing.
no, yeah, right. So I had no fear,
Yeah.
led by example. I loved being in combat. I trained the men for long hours, leading, mentoring, coaching them both on and off the battlefield. And I think for me, probably the most prevalent aspect of that was, I led hundreds of combat missions over my 3 tours, and everyone that I led came home. And
Yeah.
so for me, that is really huge. I mean, we had a couple guys that got injured, but they weren't injured on the operations that I was on, but they were still a part of the task unit. But what I can say is the areas where I led guys and was in it, they all came home safely, and I came home safely, and I thank the good Lord for that.
Yeah. It actually wanted to kind of do a quick follow on question to that because it made me think about the concept of servant leadership. And also for someone who really embraces that philosophy as a man of deep faith, and that faith has evolved over the years, partially through your SEAL career and afterwards. But when you think about servant leadership and truly effective leadership, where did that come in for you? Because we all know combat is brutal, combat is hard, it's physically and emotionally taxing. But as a leader, you don't have the uh, hence going back to the term burden of command, you don't have the time or the ability to focus on yourself. Really, obviously, you have to maintain your capability to lead others and lead men in war and combat. But you're effectively making it about the team. You're the last person on the totem pole that's important, other than being the leader and getting missions done effectively. Talk to me a little bit about your servant leadership philosophy. How did that play a role in effectiveness over hundreds of combat missions, bringing people home safely, and putting the team's needs before your own?
Well, I think you said it in that last line. I never really thought about myself, to be honest. I always thought about, the men that I led and the men that were right beside me. So, in my perspective, I always gave them everything. And if something happened to me, I was completely fine with that. I think after each deployment, my faith began to grow. So the first one happened, I came back, I was not in a good place mentally. I think it was just because, as you well know, we were out daytime, nighttime for quite a long time. And so, when you're running around in those types of areas, consistently watching your back, that does take a little bit of a toll. So I came back, I was a little bit off, and I was already kind of searching for that faith piece. So my next tour I went, and then, by the time I came back off my third tour, I realized that no matter what happened, it wasn't about me. I never had really any fear. I know people say that, like, if they tell you that if you have no fear in combat, you're a liar. But the reality is I never really feared. Like I more feared the guys that were right next to me, or the guys, if I led them in a bad situation or something happened, that was more what I was worried about. I wasn't really worried about myself. And so, I was very subservient to that and subservient to them. And I think that's kind of, from that point on, I began to lead that way in kind of everything that I did,
Yeah.
going on to my, officer career and beyond that, which, we'll get into next time. But I think that's really kind of where it all started. Before I was really trying to build the next war fighter. So I was just very aggressive. And I mean, you went through my training, so you knew, I did a lot of dark humor, because I think, that was something that had to happen during those times. But at the same time, I was very aggressive, and I wanted to make sure that you guys had the skills that were required. And what was even more interesting, going back to what I said earlier, was I wasn't sure, if I was going to be going into combat with you guys or not. It was just, that's how it all played out. And, 3 tours later, they decided that, that was enough for me.
They
I
had
had to go back, go to
bigger plans for you.
right. The Lord definitely had bigger plans for me and moved me in a
Yeah.
completely different direction, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I was rewatching 13 Hours earlier this week,
Hmm.
and a phenomenally well done movie in my opinion. And Tori, I read the book as well. They're actually pretty similar in the storytelling piece. And we had, obviously two former teammates who, passed away that during that battle. But Tonto and Boone are up on the roof at the latter part of the battle, and they're getting ready to re-engage. And Tonto says to Boone, he's like, I never get afraid. Have never really felt fear. He's like, is that weird? And he says, I feel like if I'm doing the right thing to the best of my ability, that God will take care of me. And
Amen.
Boone's response is, it's no more weird than anything else you say. But
I
he was
know,
being
right?
serious and saying that, like, to your point, like he never really felt true fear because he was a man of faith, and that the God, higher power was going to watch over him if he was doing the right thing. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because your ability to effectively lead people in combat. Obviously, you don't have the the luxury of feeling fear, or you're not leading from the front and from the rear at the same time simultaneously. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is that obviously on the job leadership development, what you were doing every single day, you evolved naturally, organically as a leader, gaining rank, gaining responsibility, leading people in combat. Was there anything that you did, any rituals, routines, or reading, or anything that you did as far as developing your own leadership journey? I know some, military leaders and things like that like to, study history or things like that. Did you have any type of routine that you did to further your own leadership skills, capabilities, or approach, throughout those years?
Well, I think, let me give me a second to think about that because that's a great question. So I continued my military education with more advanced schooling,
Mm-hmm.
developing my skills and, really becoming a subject matter expert in those areas of interest. And a
Yeah.
lot of that, as you advance in your career, a lot of those more advanced schools, they're more at an executive level, work with more senior enlisted, and higher ranking officers. And
Sure.
so during that time frame, I began to engage with strong military leaders and I began to build relationships with them. And
Nice.
after I had built those relationships, I would approach them and I would ask them if they would like to become a mentor.
Cool.
And yeah, and so for me, that was super important because as you move up, there's a curtain that you haven't seen behind before. And the more senior enlisted and the more senior officers have. So
Mm-hmm.
I was able to get that perspective from that. And now there were some that I would just learn by watching. I would
Yeah.
pick up their mannerisms, I would pick up their leadership skills, and then I would take what I had learned and I would incorporate that into my leadership skills. And over time, I developed my own leadership style. And I continue to do that throughout my career. And I've had incredible mentors as I started to work, more of the Commodores, the senior 06s became really my bosses. That's where a lot of the leadership, development started happening at the sort of more senior levels because they would say, hey, read this book or read this book or take a look at this book. Or, hey, if you really want to
Yeah.
learn something, take a look at this. So I would take a lot of cues from them. They would mentor me. They would send me emails with, some great literature on, leadership, military, and things like that. And, that's how I became a lot more skilled and a lot more advanced in my leadership approach to things. And
Right.
so, but the other side of the coin of that is I also never forgot, where I came from.
Right.
So I was an enlisted man for many, many years. And, you know, becoming an officer was great. I mean, I loved it, but I also never forgot where I came from. And I always knew that in that leadership role, there was a lot of responsibility. And so people make mistakes and, you learn from those. And so as a leader, I looked at things differently. And sometimes, individuals would maybe not do the right thing. people would go, hey, and I'd be like, first, let's just sit back and let's relax, because there's always two sides to a story.
Yep.
There's always multiple aspects to anything that happens. So I think, being able to utilize that was also super effective, and it helped me. And I think, also, being a warrant officer was great because I was in the gray, right?
Mm-hmm.
Usually the enlisted guys, you knew all the tricks. There was nothing they could really do. You knew how to, guide, mentor, inform them. And then on the other aspect, I didn't have to play any politics.
Right.
So I thought that was great. So, I was able to say what needed to be said, and that's how I've always been. So for me, that was a perfect area to be in.
Yeah, it's actually a perfect segue for my next question, because I want to talk about how your mindset evolved, and the Mustang route in the military. For those who aren't aware, going enlisted first and becoming an officer later on in your career is a very well respected position to be in, because you've seen, like you said, both sides of the coin. But whether you stay enlisted or you become an officer, and as you rise in rank in any organization, your perspective starts to change. You're privy to more information, bigger picture strategy. Like you said, you get to see behind the curtain a lot of things, and intelligence, and other types of political elements that are involved in every military organization that you're either not privy to or you don't need to know about in the lower ranking positions. And as a young SEAL, you want to be the door kicker, you want to be hitting targets, you want to be a pipe hitter, but you also have to evolve as a leader and a big picture thinker as you rise in rank, because you're not going to be the guy kicking in the door. You're going to be planning missions. You're going to be thinking about strategy. You're going to be thinking about training and development. You're going to be thinking about the organization's growth and its evolution. How did your mindset shift over time as you made that necessary transition from, combat pipe hitter, combat leader, to being a more big picture leader in the organization, and in some very complex parts of the organization? Was that an organic evolution, or were there different moments in time where you're like, I need to start thinking differently about my position as a leader in this organization?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think I knew that I had to, in order to change things, you have to move up the ladder. I mean, that's just a reality within our organization. Now, I could have stayed, a senior enlisted and probably have done some great things. I mean, I can't say that now because I didn't go that route. But at the time, I had a lot of friends that were transitioning from the more senior levels of the enlisted side and moving over into the officer and the warrant side. And a lot of them at the time were over, a dam neck. And I had a lot of friends over there. And so I had a few conversations with them on why they were doing what they were doing. And so they gave me some really good perspective. And I sat there and was like, that's very interesting. I really like where they're going and what they're doing. It was a completely different shift in how you think. So at the same time, I was also moved over to, third phase. And I knew that that was also going to put about 5 years. It was going to put me 5 years behind in making, Master Chief and so on and so forth. So I think both of those together were kind of a deciding factor. So without really letting a lot of people know, and at the time was great because at the center where I was at, both the CEO and the XO were both Mustangs. And so I had the discussion and conversation with them. They said, feel free. I let my SCA that was in third phase at the time, let him know that I was putting in one. He said, sure. He gave me, it's really actually funny. I'm not going to say any names, but he gave me a lot of SHIT. And then when I got back off my first tour as a warrant, I see him and he tries to ditch me. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Why are you over here? And he goes, oh, you didn't hear? I picked up warrant. So I thought that was kind of funny. But anyhow, that's another story. But, but through that process, going through there. And again, like I said earlier, I started to really look for mentors that were already in those positions, so I reached out to a lot of more senior warrants. One had been one of my mentors since I was 16 years old, and that was my next door neighbor that I had talked about earlier. So I talked to him a lot about that. I had talked to quite a few warrants. And, when I realized that I had picked it up, I had to make a decision. And I remember having the conversation with my wife, and she just asked me one question. And I answered that question pretty quickly. And then she said, you've already answered that. So again, I decided to move forward with that. And, that really led me down an incredible path. My first tour as a warrant was out in Guam. And that was a great experience just because of the exposure to a lot of things that I had never seen before and at the levels that I was seeing them. And, being a part of an organization that was working with a lot of, partner nations at very, very high levels, you learn really, really quickly that the way you speak, what you do, because we've talked about this a lot, everybody, their eyes are all on you. So, you had to mature quite quickly. I was already moving in that direction quite a bit. I had a lot of great mentors, that were leading me along. But, again, when you're put in those types of situations, you learn really, really quickly. If you say the wrong thing or you do the wrong thing, it can be an international incident. And so that's kind of where, it was, advanced leadership 101 on steroids, so, so I think, as you move up, that's, your mindset just gradually changes. Yeah. But I mean, there is definitely a moment where you go, okay, understanding where I came from, but I had to detach from the fact that I was enlisted. It took a while because obviously I was enlisted for, 17 years. And I remember it was quite funny when I was going through the process of becoming a warrant. I had to set up my own board, and I had some great guys on my board. One of them, is pretty famous right now, but as we were having a discussion and a conversation, he looked at me and goes, if you do this, you can't go back. once you're an officer, and I just said, I'm good. And he goes, are you sure? And I said, yes. He's like, okay. And so, again, there's that mind shift there. But I mean, I think you also have to really engage with people that are going to elevate you. So I kept my close friends close, but I also, like I said, I started to get mentors from more senior leaders because I knew that that's the direction that I wanted to go. And then eventually, obviously, where I spent the last 10 years was a whole nother level.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about what you talked about. It is, one of the main takeaways I think for people watching this is as you move up, in your career as a leader or, elevate to new positions in, large, complex organizations, you have a much heavier burden of command, more responsibility, more complexity to deal with. So reaching out to the people who've been there, done that, the other leaders in the organization, and just asking, be like, will you mentor me? I mean, that garnered probably a lot of respect for you to ask. There's a lot of folks out there who probably wouldn't ask or wouldn't be courageous enough to ask for help. But learning from them, I would imagine, was, as you mentioned, was an incredible part of that journey. And probably helped you avoid some pitfalls that others may not have avoided in their career.
Yeah, I think that's a great. So when I went over to trade at one, and I was running assaults, and then eventually maritime and TGM, the operations officer John was probably one of my biggest mentors as a warrant. That 2 years that I was there, I learned so much from him. He challenged me. I mean, he engaged with me. There was times where I felt like flipping over his table, but I mean, he knew exactly, what the job really took. And I mean, he held me to account on everything. And so, I really appreciated that. And he really kind of, set the stage as a warrant. And then from that point on, it was really 05s and 06s and 07s and a few, dare I say 08s? No, a few 07s. Yeah. That really, took my evolution, more senior leadership to the next level.
Yeah. Well, Mathew, always fascinating conversation to pick your brain on leadership. Thank you so much for today. Next time, part 3 of Leadership Journey, obviously with you, Mathew Lehnig. I want to look at, obviously, with maintaining certain levels of operational security, but I want to look at your last 10 years as, one of the highest ranking, senior leaders in naval special warfare amidst one of the most complex parts of the organization, without saying too much. But because that had to be probably one of the most rewarding, but also one of the most challenging parts of the latter part of your career. And I think that's going to be a really, really interesting way to in this series is looking at that, and then forward looking at how you're utilizing these skills now with Taking Point Leadership, and what you're doing with the opportunity to teach senior leaders in global organizations. So for that, thank you everybody who watched today and or are watching the recording. Again, brought to you by Taking Point Leadership. Learn more about us at takingpointleadership.com, and definitely check out our e-learning platform and change leadership certification course at takingpointacademy.com. Until next time, keep taking point.